I would say that all the nations, including Israel, you can say this generally of all nations in the Old Covenant, they were all overseen by angelic forces. And that word angelic forces means a kind of supernatural forces. I mean, angels. But there are fallen angels and there are good angels. All the other nations outside of Israel were overseen by the fallen angels, and Israel was overseen by the good angels. And we know this from, again, I think it's Acts 7, where it's said that the law was given to Israel by angels, not just Moses, but I mean, Moses was the mediator between the angels who were overseeing Israel and giving Israel God's law. So that's the way I look at it.
Kevin, in Isaiah chapter 10, there's a verse that says, O Assyrian, the rod of my anger and the staff in their hand is my indignation. And then down in verse 12, it says, Wherefore it shall come to pass that when the Lord has performed his whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his high looks. For he says, By the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent. Okay. And then in verse 15, it says, Shall the axe, the Assyrian king is the axe, boast itself against him that hews therewith? Shall he boast against God, right? Or shall the saw magnify itself against him that shakes it? And so just had a question. My question pertains to here's God using Assyria, right, as his rod of anger. In other words, was Assyria only going to be judged because he's being prideful? Like, in other words, that some people have said that Assyria, there isn't a legitimate part about Assyria and being there, but the illegitimate part is the pride that he had in what he did. That it was okay for him to go and stomp Israel and, basically judge them. But the fact that he was just that prideful about it was the part that delegitimized Assyria. And so the argument, does that argument make sense?
You mean that if he had engaged in rape and plunder and spoil and destruction with a different attitude, that the rape and destruction would have been okay? Is that what you're saying? I mean, is that what the argument is?
I think so. I think so. Right? I mean, you help me to steel man the argument, can you?
I'm not sure there is an actual argument there, because I'm looking at verse 7. It says, It is his intent to destroy and to cut off many nations. He wants to be the strongest nation and he will destroy other nations. Well, what biblical right can you say exists for some dictator, totalitarian dictator, to destroy other nations? I mean, how is that a legitimate moral enterprise?
Right.
And obviously that is attached to or in some way related to the sin of pride, to say I get to be the most strongest nation on earth, therefore I get to rape and destroy other nations. Sure, I mean there's pride involved in saying I'm so great that I can destroy all the other nations so I can be on top, but I don't see how you distinguish those sins and to say that it would have been okay for him to steal property by destroying it and take people captive and kill and do all these other horrible things if he had a better attitude. What possible attitude can you have when you're bent on destruction and becoming the totalitarian ruler of others?
I think that's a good question. What other attitude can you have when you're committing such heinous evil acts? Because
Mass destruction, mass murder. How can you have a good attitude? What good attitude is possible?
so was this like a righteous act from the king of Assyria and in performing this act of judgment on Israel? Would that be a righteous act?
I don't see how it could be. I mean, how can you say that it is righteous to engage in destruction of property, kidnapping, or murder? I mean, you've got right there, I mean, you've got at least two capital crimes. And then you've got the sin of destruction, which would require massive restitution, which he had no intention of doing because it wasn't his intention to borrow and then return the goods. His intention was to steal or destroy, but in any sense, his intention was to destroy any political rival and put himself at the top of the heap. Seems to me.
So to sum up this instance, God is using Assyria like a chessboard, and he is sovereignly choosing them to carry out real punishment and
Evil,
judgment against Israel.
right?
And like you said, what other attitude would there be if some king is going to go do these heinous evil acts? It's going to be with all sorts of stout-heartedness and pride and arrogance, and God's going to turn around and judge that.
Even if you could imagine somebody doing such horrible things, such terrible evil, killing, kidnapping, and property destruction, I don't see how it's possible on a human level that there could be a good attitude. What could be the good attitude? I don't know what it is, but it wouldn't outweigh the evil. I mean, he's committing sins by kidnapping, murdering, raping, and stealing. And so, if he was totally psychopathic, I mean, totally schizophrenic in the sense that he was like multiple personalities at the same time, whereas it's like imagine a rapist says, I actually have fond and affectionate feelings for this woman. He's still engaged in rape. He's still engaged in unconsensual sex. So it doesn't matter whether he thinks he has affection or some kind of good attitude. He's still committing a sin, a crime. And Assyria is committing a crime no matter what its attitude is.
Is it a righteous act from God's perspective? If it's an act of judgment, so there is a sense where it's like righteous to carry out judgment on a sinful people,
Right.
right?
Right.
So from God's perspective, he is carrying out this like righteous decree, but
God is carrying out the decree.
he's using a sinful instrument to carry
Right.
it out.
Right. Right.
And
And and,
so
and
like the argument would have to be like, or they're trying, it seems like they're trying to separate. They're saying the person who's bringing this argument is saying that it was righteous to go and slaughter Israel and punish Israel because that's what God wanted. But it wasn't righteous, or what's not good, that he had a stout heart about it.
it's like the murder of Jesus. In order for God to sacrifice his son and so that his blood can atone for our sins, he had to lose his life, right? And it was a righteous and merciful thing for God to offer his son as a sacrifice, but it
Yeah.
still required sin. It still required Judas to betray Christ, which John 18 or 19 says was a sin worse than Pilate's sin, which was also a sin, to sentence a righteous man to death. There had to be sin. And in a sense, there has to be the state to commit the sin of killing Jesus and making him a sacrifice.
Yeah.
But there is still a moral obligation on Judas's part not to betray Christ, and there was still a moral obligation on Pilate not to sentence to death a sinless and righteous person. And Pilate admitted Jesus was righteous. Pilate admitted there was no reason for him to be sentenced to death. Pilate only did it as a political consideration for a special interest group, namely IPAC, the Jewish lobby. So otherwise, Pilate wouldn't have done it. But anyway,
Right.
Pilate did it, and it was sinful for him to do it, and he shouldn't have done it. And so he should have repented, of what he was planning to do. And there's no way you can justify, there's no way that Pilate could be justified in doing evil, in executing the sinless Son of God. No way that can be redeemed. And in the same way, there's no way that Assyria could have justified its actions and alleviated its own moral responsibility before the supreme judge of the world, to quote the Declaration of Independence. There's no way they could have gotten around God's judgment and still committed the acts that they did, even though God predestined, God in his providence made Assyria. Like the proverb says, he turns the heart of the king whichever way he wants. So God turned the king's heart of Assyria to do massive evil. But Assyria is still morally culpable, responsible, will be held accountable, judged, and condemned for doing what God made Assyria do. Just like God made Pharaoh not send the children of Israel into the to worship God. God
Yeah.
made Pharaoh do that, but Pharaoh still had a moral obligation to not do that. He had a moral obligation, and he will be held accountable for doing what God made him do. It's a obviously a paradox. It's hard to understand how that works, but that's clearly what the Bible says, I think.
Well, Jesus's crucifixion, can be seen, I think, that God's righteous indignation and anger, or his indignation, was coming down upon Jesus on the cross, is the way I've heard. It's like he was taking the wrath of God upon him and substituting himself instead of us to do punishment for our sins. He got what we deserved, right? And in that sense, it's a righteous act from God's perspective, and it's wrath and indignation in the same way it is here in Isaiah 10, but it's carried out by sinful people.
Right. Well, I, I I don't know exactly how you intended what you just said, but I don't think that Jesus angered God. I think that when it says he bore the wrath of God, that was a judicial imputation. It was
Yeah,
a judicial accounting. It's not that God was angry at his son,
right.
but
That's
that
okay.
God's anger toward us was imputed, was put on Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I want to follow up with another question here. There was another question that I dealt with about this idea that there was government that existed before First Samuel 8, and it keeps coming up. So what I had here was this question that like this idea, like they even referenced Moses. So the first is Moses with the Ten Commandments. Clearly, he was established by God, endorsed by him, and used to punish evil and reward good. Joshua followed. Judges were mixed, but Deborah and Samuel are two examples I can think of that perform government functions as well. How would you respond to this idea that um, there was government before the government of First Samuel 8 when they wanted a king?
Okay, let me try to sharpen up the argument as best I can.
Okay.
Um, we're talking about Deborah and Samuel, who were judges. Nehemiah 9 also calls them saviors. So God sent saviors to deliver, which is the meaning of the word save, to deliver Israel from oppression by the Philistines or the Midianites or whoever it is. I mean, different judges had different problems to deal with, but they were saving Israel from the consequences of their sin, of Israel's sin. Now, given that God raised up saviors, how would that, I mean, give me the best possible argument. How does that justify what Donald Trump is doing, or Putin, or Xi Jinping, or anybody? How does God raising up saviors or judges justify any human being today stealing, kidnapping, or murdering, or
it
taking
it might
vengeance,
it
not
it
leaving
may
vengeance
not
to
be
God?
at all. I think what the argument is saying, look, they were performing civil functions. Civil functions have a place in society. And so there is this legitimacy in performing civil duties or civil functions just like they were, just like Moses was and Samuel was and Deborah was.
Okay, let's not use the word civil, just because I think that's prejudicial, because it makes us think that the thing makes us think about government and things like that. What other word can we use to describe the actions that were undertaken by Deborah, Samuel? What other word can we use to describe the functions or actions that the judges or saviors that God sent, that they committed, executed, performed? Now, if you say they're saviors, that sounds like they're a religious function. Why would you say that's a civil function to be a savior? The Bible describes them as saviors. So, in what way are they civil rather than ecclesiastical. The I can't think right offhand. I know for a fact that Acts 7 says that Israel was a church. Is there a, I don't think there can be. I don't think there is. I don't think there's a category. But is there a verse that says Israel was a state? There's a verse that says Israel was a civil body? Now, a a nation, Israel can be described as a people, an ethnic people, ethnos, nation, Gentiles. I mean, not Gentile, but a nation, God's holy nation, 1 Peter 2, Exodus 19. But that doesn't mean it was a state. I mean, I think everybody would agree that when Israel left captivity in Egypt, it was a church. Acts 7 describes Israel as the church in the wilderness, but it wasn't a state. I mean, there was a church, there was a priesthood. In what sense was it a state? Now, I go to a couple of arguments I've made elsewhere on other web pages that capital punishment was an act of shedding blood which was undertaken and overseen by priests. So that wasn't civil. That was you could say ecclesiastical if you want, but it was clearly part of the ceremonial law and not part of what I don't think there is such a thing as judicial law. But you understand what I'm saying? That was a church function, not a state function. That was not a civil function. And holy war, also overseen by priests. And Jericho, the Bible expressly describes Jericho as a whole burnt offering. And it was a sacrificial kind of a thing, a ceremonial thing. It was not civil in our modern sense of that word civil. So in what sense was Deborah or any of the judges, any of the saviors, why do we have to describe their actions as civil rather than priestly, churchly, saviorly, or any other non-civil terminology?
Is it just because they look like civil functions? Is it because of the functions that are carried out with like here's some kind of thing that looks like a penalty or that is a penalty for some kind of sin? It's automatically assumed, oh, that's what our government does today, therefore it must be civil. But that doesn't.
Like I say, if you look at capital punishment and holy war, I would argue those were priestly. Priestly terms are used for those. Atonement, sacrifice, shedding of blood, those are all priestly functions.
Okay.
So there's no function that's undertaken by anybody in Israel that we would have to say, no, that's not ceremonial or priestly, that's civil.
What about
Bahnsen
Moses?
argues this in
Yeah.
Theonomy. He tries to say there's a separation between church and state. I don't think his argument holds water. Especially if you go with capital punishment and holy war being led by priests and not necessarily by civil function. And certainly, okay, two things I would say. Number one, it's priestly, but even if somehow you got around that and said there wasn't priestly, the question is whether it had to be a monopoly or whether today it has to be a monopoly. That monopoly is what makes the state different from, say, if private businesses were executing civil functions. And that's the libertarian, radical libertarian, or anarcho-capitalist view, is that everything that human beings need to do can be done in a free market by voluntary exchange and consent. And there's no justification biblically, morally, politically for some guy saying, I have a monopoly on this function. You can call it ecclesiastical, you can call it civil, you can call it anything you want. But there's no biblical justification for one guy or one entity, organization, saying, we possess a monopoly on this function, this social function. Use the word social instead of civil, because social covers both priestly and civil. We have a monopoly on this social function, and no one else can compete against us. No one else can undertake this social function except us. Nobody can do it at a lower price. Nobody can do it with a higher quality of service. We alone have the right to do this function, this social function. And unless you can say from the Bible that some people today have a right to claim a monopoly on a social function, something that benefits the community at large, and that nobody else can do the same function, nobody else can charge a lower rate, it has to be done by this group of people who have somehow obtained a monopoly, then that eliminates the state. What you're saying is there's no such thing as the public sector, there's no such thing as civil government. There's just the provision of government functions, social order, social prosperity, getting things done is undertaken and provided by a free market under competition by different businesses who are doing these functions.
That's really good. Would you say that Moses receiving the Ten Commandments then was just carrying out that social function? Like when people were coming to him with problems, did he have a monopoly over that?
No, I don't think he did. And I can't remember the verse. It's in Numbers. Maybe I'm thinking 12:29. I'm just guessing. I can't remember. But there is a point where somebody was saying these people are doing something that should only be done by a monopoly. And Moses says, no, I wish everybody had the spirit that the 70 that the elders had. I wish everybody had this spirit and was doing these things. So I think that's a mandate for a decentralized, family centered, free market that everybody would have the spirit, everybody would have a commission or a right to perform valuable social functions and not just have it in a monopoly. I don't think Moses was saying have a monopoly. Now, you do have the instance of can't remember the guys' names, but they were swallowed up because they had an idea we want to be part of this monopoly. I think it's one thing to say everybody should be able to serve consumers in a free market and provide social functions, but it's another thing to say I want the monopoly. And they were attributing to Moses a monopoly which Moses denied, and that's why they were swallowed up into the ground. Do you know the people I'm talking about? There was like three of them, and they're mentioned again in the New Testament.
Dathan and Abiram.
Maybe I can't remember, but anyway, I don't
Yeah.
think that the Bible requires any social function or service,
Yeah.
any service to be held in monopoly by a certain group of people, by an oligarchy. Oligarchy means a small group of people ruling everybody else.
And so that's what's happening in First Samuel 8 is that is the creation of a monopoly, a state, like a state proper, a monopoly proper, where the king rules over the people
Well, I wouldn't
and
say that the people of Israel were wanting a monopoly. Maybe they would have been okay with multiple kings. I don't know. That's a different question. The question was they wanted a creature to be their king rather than the creator. That's the offense. They rejected God, the creator, as their king and wanted a creature instead of the creator, which is a violation of Romans 1:25, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the creator. Now, they might have been willing to worship and serve multiple creatures instead of the creator, and they didn't. They would, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was not Israel saying, we only want Samuel to have a monopoly on the civil powers. They weren't saying that. There wasn't a case where there was other people in Israel who were starting to deliver the people from oppressors like the saviors, the judges were, as Nehemiah 9 describes them. There wasn't competition. That's not the issue. The issue is they wanted the creature rather than the creator to be their governor. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, no, it totally does. Okay. That's good. That's really helpful to understand because a lot of people will appeal to certain things about the Old Testament that they call or they see civil, and maybe there's something in the Westminster Confession that's confused us by inserting this idea of civil and judicial functions because there's like this assumption that there's a kind of a government monopoly idea inserted into the confessions is like where did the Westminster Confession go wrong then? Like
I think
is
the Westminster people were bringing in Roman law categories. I don't think there was in the Torah, the law of the prophets, a category of civil, number one. And number two, there wasn't a monopoly granted to this category of civil. I think that whole concept comes from Roman law. And, the reformers like Calvin especially were trained in Roman law and they brought that in. And they
because
had
the
this concept of judicial law, which I don't think is a legitimate category.
because the words aren't really there in the text of scripture. You are they? I don't think
I don't
those
see any concept of civil versus ecclesiastical, civil versus priestly in the Bible itself. That distinction comes in from Roman law.
okay.
I mean, I'm willing to be proven wrong. I'm
Yeah.
always finding things in the Bible. Gee, I didn't realize that was there. But, that would be pretty weird if you find one verse that makes this distinction, clearly makes this distinction, and then also grants a monopoly. And you can always create vague premises. This is what happens all the time. People create vague premises. The premise is not really certainly true, but it sounds like it might be true, sounds like it's arguably true. I don't know for sure. And then from this vague premise, you draw a conclusion which is completely unwarranted by the Bible. And the conclusion that's being drawn from the questions that you've been asking here so far is the conclusion is, therefore, an oligarchy, that is, a small group of people, have the right to rule over the rest of the country as a monopoly. And I would say the monopoly consideration is what's really important here. The Bible doesn't give anybody a monopoly over social services. And that's really what government is. It's social services. It's not rule, it's a service. Now, in the Old Testament, some people performed the service of cleansing the land, and the word cleanse there translates the Hebrew word, which is sometimes translated cleanse and sometimes make atonement, but a social service of taking away the wrath of God by cleansing the land, making atonement through the shedding of blood. That was a priestly monopoly. But nobody has that priestly function, and nobody has that monopoly today.
I know.
And if there were somebody else who were in a position in a time in Israel where there were no priests, let's say, and somebody decided, you know what, we need to shed this guy's blood because he shed innocent blood, and that's the only way to make atonement and cleanse the land. If he did that, yeah, you can argue that people who are not priests were not allowed to do something. And that was a monopoly. But there's no government, there's no civil function where you can say from the Bible that you cannot have that civil function provided by a free market, that there has to be a monopoly. Unlike the priests, I grant there was a monopoly that the priests had in terms of sacrificing and doing those things.
Yeah.
But there's no civil function where the monopoly is protected. And people are told, do not violate this monopoly. You are not allowed to provide that social function.
Well, and now that we're all kings and priests, would you say that there's neither a monopoly? There shouldn't be a monopoly in this idea of a state, but even within the church, there isn't this clergy class that should be inserting itself as a monopoly over the rest of the body of Christ.
Well, Jesus is our king, our Messiah, our Christ, and Jesus is our high priest. So in the sense we are all priests and kings, yeah, that means we all have social functions that we can discharge, but nobody has the right to say, I am the priest, I am the king, I have a monopoly over priestly things, I have a monopoly over kingly things. Nobody can say that because we're all priests and kings, and that's what the nature of the priesthood of all believers is. And Gary North wrote that excellent essay on Protestant sacerdotalism, that somebody has a monopoly. But the passages in Revelation say we're all priests and kings. And yet, despite the fact that we're all priests and kings, nobody, no creature, has a monopoly on kingship or priesthood, in whatever sense you want to come up with it. People obviously would say nobody's a priest today. Protestants would say nobody's a priest in the way the Roman Catholics say there are priests. But whatever function you want to label as a priestly function or a kingly function, church or state, nobody has a monopoly. Nobody can say, you can't do that service. You can't perform that social function. You can't help society be a well-ordered society, which some people call government. You can't do that because I have a monopoly. Nobody can say that. As far as I can tell, nobody can say, I have a monopoly. You can't do that.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you about the demonic powers, the powers that be. The nations. It appears in Scripture that when you go to Daniel 10, the archangel Michael was fighting against the king of Persia. There was some demonic activity there. And then you have the temptation of Jesus. Satan is tempting him with all the empires, and there seems to be, like, he says, I have authority over all of these and I will give them to you. So he's like luring him. And then again, Romans 13 has this idea of like powers and principalities, like subject yourselves to the powers that be. Now, was Israel different when they had a king? It seemed like all these nations were demonic and dark: Babylon, Assyria, Rome. They're beasts. Was Israel any different in the sense of like the demonic spiritual realm? Were they separate from the rest of the world, even when they had the king thing going?
Yes, I would say they were different. I would say that all the nations, including Israel, you can say this generally of all nations in the Old Covenant, They were all overseen by angelic forces. And that word angelic forces means a kind of supernatural forces. I mean, angels. But there are fallen angels and there are good angels. All the other nations outside of Israel were overseen by the fallen angels, and Israel was overseen by the good angels. And we know this from, again, I think it's Acts 7, where it's said that the law was given to Israel by angels, not just Moses, but I mean, Moses was the mediator between the angels who were overseeing Israel and giving Israel God's law. So that's the way I look at it. And you can, there's a lot of depth and a lot of kind of like spooky stuff in the Bible about the demonic forces, which I don't claim to understand. I don't agree with Michael Heiser on everything he says, but he has done a lot of work to try to explore some of this demonic stuff that's in the Bible. But just generally speaking, I would say it looks to me like Israel was overseen by the good angels and the other nations were overseen by the fallen angels.
Yeah, well, even Daniel chapter 10 with Michael the archangel, he's like, sorry, I was held up because I was fighting with the king of Persia for 3 weeks, or I was
Right. It's not like he was working with the king of Persia or the king of Greece, the prince of Persia, prince of Greece. There's antagonism there. And I think generally you see this antagonism between Israel and the other nations. And that's what's going on, I think, in some degree in 1 Samuel 8. We want a prince, we want a Daniel 10 prince, like the other nations have, which is even worse, I would say, than wanting a creature for a king. They weren't just rejecting God as their king because they wanted a creature as a king. They wanted a demon as a king. And of course, there's verses in the Old Testament that says Israel's worshiping demons. So, yeah, I'd say that the Gentile nations were demonically controlled. Now, that doesn't mean that they're just psychopathically crazy evil, because there can be conniving evil. Evil can be sophisticated businessmen. So they're still trying to get things done in a social way, in a profitable way, in an organized kind of a way, but they're doing things outside of the control of God. They're not, whatever you do, eat or drink, 1 Corinthians 10, do to the glory of God. They weren't doing it to the glory of God. They were doing things that you might say are necessary. You might say are valid social functions, but they were doing it outside of the of allegiance to God. They were being their own gods.
Well, that's like government. Like a lot of people in government say, "Hey, well, this is for a good cause," and
Right.
governments have done a lot of these good things, but it's like it's all outside. It really is. I mean, my point is that look, the way they're doing it is essentially with a gun. Like they're forcing with a gun at the end of the day. Like it's a monopoly of force, of violence over others, and you don't do something bad over here so you can do something good over there. Like the ends don't justify the means. That's not right. God doesn't, shall we do evil that good may come in the end? No, you can't do that, I don't think.
Well, it's not only the aspect of a monopoly of violence, which is absolutely true, but there's also a sense in which when the government does it and it's not doing it according to God's law, it does it in a perverse way that actually makes things worse. I mean, you look at the short run. This is the economics in one lesson that Henry Hazlitt was talking about. Don't just look at the short run of the government doing something that's good, but look at the long-term effect of government doing it the wrong way, government doing it not God's way, providing, yes, a valuable social service, but when they do it the wrong way, not God's way, the short term might look good, but the long term is bad. So for example, education, the government takes care of education, but the long term effects are that people actually get stupider under government education for all kinds of various economic reasons. Government says we're going to take care of the elderly. We're going to give the elderly social security. Well, the best way to do that in God's perspective, as I see it, is the children should take care of their parents. That's the best way. If the children can't be taking care of their parents, maybe their neighbors, the neighbors of these children who aren't taking care of their parents or are doing things when they're young, they're going to result in the fact that their parents are going to be neglected. Maybe when they're young, their neighbors should encourage them to get a job so that they can take care of their parents. Or maybe the neighbors need to pitch in. But when it's done from the heart, we're saying we see a social problem, we're taking care of it. But when the government does it, then it supplants the family, it supplants the neighborhood, it supplants all these people who are doing these things, and now we think I have a right to have the government pay me while I'm retired, and we move from rights, government rights, to entitlements, and it breaks down the social fabric of the country because we no longer have neighbors, we no longer have responsible children, and there isn't that spirit of let's help, and there isn't a spirit of gratitude, thank you for helping me. There's a spirit of entitlement on the part of the recipients, and there's a part of irresponsibility on everybody else's part because, well, that's the government's job. I don't have to care about my neighbor. I don't have to care about my parents. That's the government's job. So in the long run, society fragments and we really go downhill.
So even when people say, look, the government's done some good things, it's like, but have you really, even those things that you're saying, look at the long-term effects of those things? I mean, maybe in the
Right,
short run, they might appear that they're good, but have they really turned out that way?
right, exactly. Don't just look at the immediate benefit, but look at the long-term results of government action. And the long-term results of government action, that's your economics in one lesson. The long-term results of government action are always bad. They're a net negative, not a net positive when you consider all the facts.
Awesome. Okay, so I have to keep moving on. And I know we've covered these questions so many times, but my beloved aunt would like an answer to this one. So, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. Is that statement like legitimizing Caesar's existence as Caesar?
Well, we have to remember that before Christ was born, Caesar, the Caesar of Christ's day, invaded Israel, slaughtered thousands of Jews, violated Israel's national sovereignty, set up a military dictatorship, a thuggish, violent military dictatorship, and started plundering Israel, taking forced labor and also tribute, taxation. Now, what if Israel, if Italy, and Rome is in Italy, if Italy invaded Israel today in 2026 and said, we're going to enslave Israelites and make them manufacture, make them work for our factories manufacturing Italian sports cars. This will increase the Italian economy, help our Italian economy. The United Nations, every other nation would say, Italy, you cannot invade Israel. That's totally wrong. And enslaving the people and stealing from them and killing them and, putting the sword to their neck and forcing them to carry your backpack for 2 miles, Matthew 5:41, totally immoral, violations of international law. Even the United Nations, which usually doesn't favor Israel very well, and that's Israel's complaint. The United Nations doesn't recognize our rights and all sorts of things. Even the United Nations in 2026 would say, Italy, what are you doing? You can't invade Israel like that. But that's what Caesar did. And
Well, what?
so when Jesus says, do not resist evil, render unto evil Caesar,
Mhm.
pray for those who persecute you, he's not saying Caesar had a legitimate, moral, biblical, godly right, or even a right under some kind of international law to invade Israel and conquer Israel and subjugate Israel. Jesus isn't saying Caesar had a right to do all those evil things.
Yeah.
He's just saying, render unto Caesar, bless those who persecute you, do not resist evil.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. But what if someone would just say, well, that's just because like Caesar still had a right to be there and exist. He just needed to be good. He was just being bad in those situations, but he still had a like they would still say, well, yes, that's he's a bad leader, but there's good leaders too. And he needed to be a good leader.
Well, we just addressed that because we said that in the short run, a leader might appear to be good, but actually is doing bad because they're doing things violently and they're not doing it God's way. So that's the question. What leader is doing things God's way? A good leader is going to say, you people need to do this. How can I encourage you people to be good neighbors, good parents, good children, good business owners, good teachers? How can I encourage you to do this? Not forcibly making them do it the leader's way.
Yeah, and is that where just the whole kings of the Gentiles, um, you know, that whole philosophy of the kings of the Gentiles that Jesus is talking about in Mark 10:42 through 45? That's what he's talking about. This is the platform or the way they do things, the kings of the Gentiles, is through coercion and force. And That's bad. And I don't want you to have anything to do with that. I want you to be, in contrast to that, servants.
Right. And if you're a servant, then you're saying what capitalists say, the customer is king. I'm not the king, the customer is king. And you know that the problem is the state is always claiming a monopoly. It always claims a monopoly. Otherwise, it's not a state. It's not a civil government. It's just one actor in the economy. And if there are other actors who are able to provide the same services like education or welfare or whatever it is, then it's not the state anymore. If the state only exists as the state if it's engaged in a compulsory, violent, enforced monopoly. Otherwise, it's just another Rotary Club or a business or a charity or something like that. But the radical libertarian, or I would say the biblical view, is to have multiple, decentralized, everybody's doing the good thing. And you don't have just one guy saying, I'm the only guy who gets to do things.
Yeah. Okay, really good. Okay, now another question from my aunt. Why were they when you look at the Old Testament and you see Israel going in and just massacre, like genocide, massacring all of these Canaanite people? There's war there, there's weapons there, there's military, there's what seems like a government and stuff like that of going in, obviously. So well, maybe there wasn't a government at that point. It might look, people might think it is, but it's, as far as military and killing and death, how do you explain that? How do you explain Joshua going and killing all these people? And then even after that, when David is going and continuing to kill Philistines, or going and rescuing I think it was his family and those people who were taken, he goes in and he kills a bunch of people in order to get him back. Can you go through and talk about a little bit of this?
Well, it's a thorny subject and it does require some thoughtful consideration. And I know that there's this guy named Paul Copan who has written a couple of books on this moral quandary, it makes us think what's going on here. And there's lots of issues to be raised. The two issues I raise are, number one, the Bible expressly says that God was making Jericho a a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering. In other words, Jericho would not accept the sacrifices that Israel was doing as priests to the nation. When Israel is sacrificing 70 bulls for the 70 nations, they were rejecting that. And so God is making them the sacrifice. And elsewhere in the Bible, it speaks of these wars as a sacrifice. So there's this priestly aspect to what they were doing in there because they were cleansing the promised land before the children of Israel went in. And they were cleansing it by the same thing as capital punishment, shedding the blood of these people so that they're cleansing the land with their own blood because of the blood they shed, innocent blood that they shed. Now, the second question is, does anybody today seriously believe that they have a right to invade another nation and wipe them all out? There's no possible biblical justification for that kind of mass destruction today. So however you explain what was going on then, you'll never get to the point where you can say, okay, see, President so-and-so or Prime Minister such and such has a right to do the same thing and to go into another nation and completely wipe them all out. But even if you come across some kind of justification for killing people, for destroying people, then again, that's the monopoly. Why is it that if a certain group of people need to be killed for some reason, and I don't know what that reason would be, but why is it that a group of people can't hire professional mercenaries to go in there and kill those people? Why does there have to be a compulsory monopoly called civil government, which can tax people who don't want to go in there and kill all those people? Why can't you just have the people who say, we need to kill those people? Why can't they hire mercenaries and go in there and kill them and not be the state, but just be private contractors, private enterprises, a private group, a church, a charity, a Rotary Club, whatever. Let them kill the people. So right. There's no justification for the monopoly, even if you grant the legitimacy of what they're doing, which I don't think you can do. I don't think you can grant the legitimacy of doing it or the legitimacy of having a monopoly to do that.
There you go. Yeah. So questioning the legitimacy of whether they're even allowed to on a theological basis You mentioned holy wars, that there is a holy war aspect to the Old Testament wars. Well, what does that mean? That means that there is some type of purification taking place. As far as understand, there's a pollution of the land, and before Christ, things are blood. There's blood everywhere. Just read all through the pages of the Old Testament, and you're going to find blood on every page. And so that's what you would see in a pre-Christ world before the blood of Christ is shed. So there's purification that's needing to take place, and it sounds like you're saying that the Israelites are basically going in and offering a whole burnt offering because this is religious, this is ecclesiastical, or it's a churchy function, it's a churchy thing going on.
It doesn't legitimize the creation of a civil government.
Yeah.
That's the point I'm making. But however, there is also another sense in which Israel was given a commission of vengeance. I mean, Romans 12 says, leave vengeance to God. But if God says to someone, I mean, really actually truly says to someone, in the same way, for example, that God said to Abraham, sacrifice Isaac. But if God says to somebody, I want you to kill these people because you're my instrument of vengeance, and this was actually a special revelation from God to this person, you need to go in there and kill them to take vengeance on my behalf, then that person should do that. And you can't question God's direction. If God actually directed him to do that, you can't question that. The question is today, is anybody on earth today, have they been given a special revelation from God to kill people? And my answer is no. Nobody has been given that command.
I don't know how you would even be able to claim that. You'd obviously be some kind of Pentecostal person claiming that you have some word of the Lord to wipe someone out, which would be totally crazy in my opinion.
Well, you've got Trump has some pretty flaky advisors, religious advisors, who might tell him that he has God's right or permission to go in and kill a bunch of people. So that's always dangerous, but it's not biblical.
That's scary. Well, okay, then going back to Assyria though. So would Assyria, the Syrian king, be able to say, look, I have a right to stomp on these people, stomp on their heads, Israel's heads? And
I think they said that. They have a right, but they didn't say they got it from God. They didn't say God told us. Yahweh, the God of Israel, told us to go and take vengeance on Israel.
yeah,
That's what God was doing, but that's not what Assyria was doing. I mean, in Assyria's mind, they were just being the biggest evil state on the planet. That's all that was in their mind.
yes.
Now, if God had said to Assyria, go in there and take vengeance on me, then God would not have said in the second half of Isaiah 10, I'm going to destroy Assyria. God has destroyed Assyria because Assyria was not obeying God.
Kevin, last question. I just love asking you questions. In Romans 13, I just want to kind of finish with this. Is Romans 13, when it's talking to the Christians and subjecting themselves to the powers that be, it also talks about how the minister is a rewarder of those who do good, and then he's a punisher of those who do evil. Is that a prescriptive? Is that a prescriptive statement directed towards governments in any way, or is it's getting kind of dark? By the way, you're getting I don't know, you're like the darkest man on the internet right now, bro. It's I can barely I can see your fan and then you a little bit. There you go. It's so funny.
It
like
got really dark here in the last few minutes. It was kind of almost sunny there for a minute. I need to buy a light. Like everybody else has a light in front of them. I need a light in front of me.
People will say, look, government is needful, it is necessary, it is legitimate, and their purpose is to like what it says, like what they think Romans 13:4 says, that they're to reward the good and to punish the evil. That's what they should be doing. But is that the way we're supposed to look at that? I mean, is it prescriptive in that way, or is it descriptive of what is true about that function that God is doing with them?
Well, I would say every human being has a duty to praise those who do good. And I guess it's a question of delegation of powers. Under our theory of government in the United States, the government has powers which we, the people, give the government. Now, obviously, in some nations, the government just claims like a divine right or something like that. They don't try to justify it the same way we do in the United States. the United States, the government only has the powers that we, the people, give it. Well, so where do we, the people, get a right to do certain violent things like I want money, therefore I have the right to steal it from you and threaten physical violence against you if you don't give me your money? Nobody has a right to do that. So we can't delegate that right to the government. We can't say, let's create a constitution and give the government the right to steal from people because we don't have that right. We can't give it to government. And then another thing is, even if we all have the right to steal from each other if we need the money, we don't have the right to give the government a monopoly on the right to steal money, because if it's a right we all have, how can we say on day one, on the first day, Jones and Smith both have the right to engage in theft to raise money, but on day two, Jones all of a sudden has a monopoly on the right to steal from everybody else, and Smith no longer has that right because Jones has a monopoly. Where do we get the right to confer a monopoly on those powers if the powers are legitimate? But I would say the powers aren't legitimate. The right to steal is not a legitimate right, and the right to have a monopoly on the power to steal is not a just thing. It's a fiction. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. But again, going back to this prescriptive versus descriptive part of Romans 13, and whether is it talk, people will say it's what they should be doing. I mean, I guess obviously they should be doing good, right? But should they also be punishing evil, would you say?
Well, what exactly does that mean? What did it mean in the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire put Jesus on a cross. Was that was that right? I mean, the Roman Empire did some pretty evil things which went under the rubric of punishing evil. And we see, I think also in First Peter 2, we see the same kind of a statement being made. And I think it's clearer in First Peter 2 that there is a sense in which it's generally true that governments punish competitors. That is, it punishes thieves, kidnappers, and killers who compete against the government's monopoly to steal and kill and murder and kidnap. So they do punish bad guys who are competitors. So and First Peter 2 makes it very clear. Don't be punished by the government for being a bad guy. But if the government punishes you for being good, which is a real thing, it actually happens. The government punishes good people. If that happens and you're doing good and the government is punishing you for doing good, you can expect God's praise for being punished for doing good, but you don't get any praise from God for being punished for doing evil. So,
Yeah.
but the government doesn't have a right to claim a monopoly and to engage in all kinds. The first Romans 12, which precedes Romans 13 by nothing more than an arbitrary division line of chapter divisions, Romans 12 says, leave vengeance to God, which I think means leave punishment to God. I mean, what's the difference between punishing and taking vengeance? It's the same thing. So the state has usurped the right that God says he alone possesses. And if you say, no, some human beings have the right to take vengeance, some people have the right to punish evil, then everybody, it's like we go back to the kings and priests things. We're all kings, we're all priests, we all have the right to punish evil. Whatever that right is, the government does not have a right to punish you for exercising your right to punish evil. It doesn't have the right to claim a monopoly. But then we have to say, well, what does it mean to punish evil? And who gets to do that? And how does the state get that power if we don't have that power? And how does the state get a monopoly to prevent other people from exercising that power if they have the power? Which I would say nobody has that power. Vengeance belongs to God.
Right. And so your whole point is saying, look, these are bad forces. These are bad characters. And that's the whole point, is that God is using them sovereignly in that sense, in a predestinating providential sort of way. In that sense, they're ordained, not in a moral approval sort of way. Like when it says established, that word, I think, can get people confused.
Ordained, yeah. Ordained does not mean approved. It just means God is sovereign. God has sovereign control over these governments, these evil, violent monopolists, but not that they have God's approval. They certainly don't have a command. They haven't been commanded, just like Assyria was not commanded in a special revelation sense to destroy, rape, pillage, and kill Israel. They didn't have a special command. No government today has a special command, but
Yeah,
God has ordained them in the
right.
sense that He set them up. He has put them in positions of power to accomplish His purposes. They serve His purposes.
It,
They
it
are His
seems
ministers.
it seems to me then to get past or get through this whole myth of government or the myth of good government, but the myth of legitimate government is that you have to stop believing that there's like good government, there's some good, and then there's some bad. You have to see that Romans 13 and all of Scripture is saying, look, it's all bad.
Yeah, I would have to say it's all bad because whatever you say is good either should have been done by everyone or someone on a decentralized free market kind of a basis, or it shouldn't be done at all. I can't think of any way to say that having a government is better than having a free market because a free market can anything that human beings need to do, socially speaking, anything that human beings need to do can be done through cooperation, competition, voluntary consent. There's nothing that human beings need to do which can only be accomplished by a monopoly of violence.
Yeah. When you think about heaven on earth, or on earth as it is in heaven, as the prayer goes, what better thing would we all want to see than in a true free market when people do a trade and when people are at like I sell something to you and you get something that you want, just like it happens every day. And what do people say? I say thank you. And what do you say? Thank you. There's like this mutual thank you. We both benefited, right? And like think about the world of government when you get your tax, your tax bill. And are they saying thank you? Are you saying thank you? I mean, thank you in the sense of like God using all things together for good, even evil things like them taking all this money to support things that are ungodly. But it's not a beautiful. The world is an ugly place when government it exists, and the whole point of the vine and fig tree worldview that's so beautiful is that it's the world without a monopoly of force and violence and compulsion over others, and it's a true beautiful thing. And we care about beauty, we care about the kingdom of God, and we want to see that be realized on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah, the free market is a beautiful thing in the sense that it's amazing how much good things are done by people who are cooperating. And yeah, but government pollutes that. Government just makes everything worse.
Yeah, and so I think that that's how the kingdom of God is to operate. It's what it looks like. It looks like a free market and people working together in love for one another. And the increase of his government, there shall be no end. So I think we're living in a place where we're going to see, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, real progress. So,
Well, I think that governments are, generally speaking, a lot better than governments in Isaiah's day. So when Isaiah speaks of a day when the kingdom, the Messiah, the Prince of Peace, his government and peace increase, that we've seen that prophecy fulfilled. We've seen it continually being fulfilled. It will be fulfilled even more.
wait, Mr. Kevin.
She turns and looks at you every time I wave.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Kevin. Well, those were the main questions that I had for today. And as always, you did an excellent job answering them. And it's getting dark again. You're starting to slowly fade. But I'll try to get this audio up soon. Thanks again for being so available to answer questions, hard questions. You're
I
good
need
at.
to. Yeah, my light was good when we first started, but
What do you got there? Is that your broom?
I got some. Yeah, I got a
For
broom here
people who don't know, Kevin lives
picking up
in
my
this
drapes. There, now I got some more
little
light.
little apartment that's pretty cold. What's the temperature in there right now? Would you say in the 40s, maybe?
No, it's 50 in here. I got heaters going in here. It's
Okay.
40 in the basement. It's 35 in the big room, 25 in the dining room.
Vine, that's at Vine and Fig Tree. So one
World
day we'll be over
headquarters.
there. That's world headquarters of Vine and Fig Tree. All right, we'll talk to you later. Thanks, Kevin.